Hey everyone, thanks again for coming out. And I say that all the time, and I know you have to. Today's lectures, I've given a few lectures, is going to be about international institutions. But this is going to be a little different sense. Yes, the World Health Organization is an international institution, and we've had regional and international health institutions before for varying degrees of success. Now, one of the things that's very important about this, I am doing this in the middle of our coronavirus outbreak, and obviously we're under, to a certain extent, depending on where you are, on in quarantine. But I want to stress a few points about this. Why do we have international institutions to begin with? Realists, if you know realist theory, they basically say the world is dominated by anarchy, and anarchy is essentially the fact that there is no 911 to call. So if someone breaks into my house, you can call 911. Now, in the international system, we don't have 911. So international institutions, for many of them, like a man named Mersheim, Kenneth Waltz, etc., is just window dressing and actually very dangerous because these institutions give this false hope. But neoliberal institutionalists believe even though we live under anarchy, it can still facilitate cooperation. And as the old saying goes, no man or woman is an island, no state or country or non-state actor is an island. And we need these institutions in order to facilitate cooperation. Now, that the neoliberal institutions support it because they think it facilitates cooperation not only in the big issues of high politics, war, etc., but like the environment and, of course, with the World Trade Organization, which we're going to get into, but the World Health Organization. But did it fail? You're going to be reading some articles on the coronavirus. Did the World Health Organization fail? At the present time, President Trump of the United States is saying he's going to cut funding for the organization because it completely failed? Or did it not do as bad as a job as the critics say? I mean, it addressed Ebola, SARS, etc. The biggest criticism is that it reflected the attitude and the policy of China downplaying the role the coronavirus had in the world, basically that they had it under control. But then there's other evidence stating that the World Health Organization did warn people, and it was the countries themselves, like the Trump administration and other states, that were downplaying the spread of the coronavirus and its impact. So this is something you're going to have to decide. But when you look at the United Nations, when you look at all these institutions, I really want you to think, are the neoliberal institutionalists right? Do they facilitate cooperation? Another criticism of these institutions, in addition to obviously that the World Health Organization just failed, is that it's basically for world powers. So, the United Nations is dominated by Russia, China, Germany, France, the Security Council. And those are the winners basically of World War II, although I don't know if France can be considered, I still don't get that, to be considered a winner of World War II. It was dominated, was within 48 hours after Germany went in. But, these five powers that UK, again, I don't know if they're a big winner either, but UK, Russia, the former Soviet Union, China, the United States, obviously in France. And what we have here is it's dominated by world power. But not only that, some of the criticisms say it's dominated by economic interest. So if you see behind me, you probably know, as you've seen my videos on YouTube, is that I have participated and witnessed many protests in Latin America. That's my area of expertise. So if you look behind me, that was a protest. Look at how they took the cobblestone, they ripped it up. This was a long time ago, this protest. I'm not that old, but and they were out there. The students, when I was a professor at the University of Santo Americano, would go out there protesting the World Bank, particularly because they had policies and the IMF of cutting back education, privatization, which is taking businesses and putting in private hands, which only the rich of the United States and other countries, and like even Mexico, Carlos Slim could go in. He's one of the richest men in the world, and buy up all of their water, like Bolivia, which was a titanic problem. No pun intended, titanic water, but when they privatized water in Bolivia, it was absolutely disastrous. So, and this created the water wars, as we see. So what happens is a lot of people criticize these institutions and say that they're just mouthpieces for the more developed nations that basically make them privatize their resources, cut back on education, etc., and do things the IMF called these structural readjustment policies that are disastrous for these countries. And you see behind me this protest. So is it or is it not? I don't know. That's going to be something that you're going to have to decide, part of it. And these international institutions have a huge problem. As you can see behind me now, there's a young girl. She's dressed in the typical Latin American uniform for school, but then she's selling water in the street after. The United Nations had tried to address this, and the United Nations initially said no more child labor, but then realized that that was bad and that they had to regulate child labor to basically make sure people weren't falling under the poverty line. So they would allow this young girl here in the back of me. She's selling water, if you could see. That was agua. They used to sit there and they're in these little bags, and then you just rip it and you drink it. And she's basically selling, but this is very difficult. I took that photo. It's very sad because these people are very vulnerable to abuse and other things. But, you know, the United Nations came out and said, we want to regulate child workers, opposed to just getting rid of them because they are a necessity. But they have their hands full because there's a wide range of issues. And at the local issues, I have the opportunity in Nicaragua to work for the United Nations. In fact, I gave a speech at some United Nations thing that came here in Tempe, that Model United Nations. And one of the interesting things is they do some good work on the ground, you know, helping women, helping children, etc., that you don't hear much about. But then there are cases of abuse, like that Frontline video that is all about the scandals of sexual abuse in the United Nations of people they were trying to help. I mean, this is devastating to the reputation of the United Nations. So I want you to decide, are these institutions good? But the World Trade Organization, you read things about the IMF, they consider is just a mouthpiece for the powerful countries, and they impose policies on developing countries that they themselves wouldn't want on them. So it's like the IMF will go into structural readjustment policies. That is, if you want a loan, you have to basically cut back, and that means on health, and we're in the middle of the coronavirus, and education and other things, and this becomes disastrous for these countries and create these types of protests that I have witnessed. In fact, if you can see here, behind me is a protest. Now we're changing to Colombia. That before was Nicaragua, was a protest I was in for education. And I took this photo, and behind me is a rótulo, a big pancata, sign, whatever you want to call it. And they're basically saying on this side over here, you know, they have pictures of weapons saying we're spending all this money on weapons. Duque and before Uribe were big supporters of what we call Plan Colombia, the militarization. A lot of people think of foreign aid, although it's probably always like that they're spending too much on weapons and not enough on the opposite, basically education. And this becomes a problem. And is this reflected in international institutions? And I really want you to start thinking about this. And there's even a theory, hegemonic stability theory, which basically states that hegemonic powers like the United States, China, keep the international system going. So these international institutions, finance like the World Trade Organization that facilitates trade across the world, is actually good for these countries. But living in these countries, I lived in Latin America 8 years and I still travel, a lot of people disagree. They think the policies that they're imposing, you would never accept yourself. In fact, it's funny, I published just an op-ed in a Nicaraguan newspaper on the IMF and World Bank, a little critical, and they actually called my house and told me I can't publish things. like, that's crazy. The IMF called my house in Nicaragua. How do you even get a phone number in Nicaragua? It was a landline at the time. You know, I mean, we obviously had cell phones. I'm not that old, but they found a landline number and called me and told me, oh, you can't publish stuff like that. So the IMF, World Bank aren't exactly what you would call democratic. They're very authoritarian, particularly in these developing countries. And that's not the only point of international institutions I wanted to stress. Remember, there were other alternative international institutions behind me. Now we're going to Ecuador. I was in Ecuador for a bit doing research on South-South relations, and this was the building for UNASUR. That was an initiative, and you can see the flags on the other side of all the South American countries. That was an initiative to basically create a regional institution of South American countries, Venezuela, Bolivia, etc., and in order to replace, not necessarily completely replace, the United Nations, or what we call the OAS, that's the Organization of American States, but many countries during this time, this was with the rise of the left in Latin America, saw these institutions as being dominated by hegemonic powers like the United States and just enforcing U.S. interests. So they wanted to create another institution, and one was UNASUR, that was the Union of South American States, in which they would address their issues without the United States. Now, it depends on which class you're in with me, but I give my article that I'm getting published. It's on South-South relations, and it addresses UNASUR and other institutions and initiatives that were like South-South relations. South-South relations is basically to replace the North-South divide and to make sure that South-South relations can kind of marginalize the interests of the bigger powers to allow space for alternative policies that wouldn't be considered. So UNASUR has done good things, like addressed instability in Bolivia. It helped a while back between Colombia and Venezuela, which has historically had problems with their border. It actually facilitated cooperation and sailed relations with them. That was a while back. Now it's gotten worse between these two countries, and now UNASUR doesn't even exist. The new president, which actually ran on a progressive agenda in Ecuador, did a complete right turn, and then it became a real right winger and closed UNASUR. Its capital was in the capital of Ecuador. This is kind of way out in Ecuador. As you can see, it's like kind of mountainy outside of Quito, and he closed it. It was like a big surprise. So I'm so lucky I went there when it existed, and I was very lucky to see what it essentially was. So this is the building. It was very, very beautiful building outside of Quito, Ecuador. And in this picture, this is the president of, the Secretary General of UNASUR at the time, Kirchner. He died, and they put the statue up for him, Nestor Kirchner. He's a former president of Argentina. We're very supportive of South-South relations, of the South American countries getting together to deal with their own problems opposed with the influence of the United States. Of course, as we know now, these countries, South America, basically went in a right turn. Bolsonaro of Brazil just fired his health minister because they weren't on the same page about the coronavirus, and the coronavirus was spreading throughout South America. So this was a big problem, but it was kind of a right turn. But Argentina now has gone back to the left. In fact, the man behind me, the statue, his wife is now vice president. She was president before of Argentina, and she basically went back to vice president. So that's very exciting development. So you never know, the right comes back, it goes out of style, then the left comes back, it goes out of style. So you never know what's going to happen here in South America, any country whatsoever. But I want you to think, are these institutions good? The World Trade Organization, that's an institution to facilitate trade across countries. Some people say that no, it's basically for corporate interest. The IMF, the same thing. World Bank privatizing loans, indebting countries, and you see a lot of protests against those institutions, but then again, a lot of people need them. Recently, Venezuela, who's been against the IMF, has gone for funding from the IMF, but that's because it's the lender of last resort. They tried a movement, the Banco del Sur, the South American bank, in order to weed their way away from away from these big institutions. And it did work in one case on Argentina, the Banco del Sur. It wasn't called that at the time. It was an initiative called La Declaración de Orinoco, the Declaration of Orinoco, an area of Venezuela, where they did fund Argentina so Argentina could pay off the IMF and go through different policies. So a lot of these South-South relations have been fruitful, but you don't hear much about them. So I want you to think about that. Should South-South relations kind of supplant the North-South relations? And we can talk about this. And I'm excited about your discussion boards. Please leave any questions you have in the community forum. I miss all the discussions because all of our classes have gone online, and then some online classes. We'll see this lecture on international institutions, and I hope everyone is doing well and is safe out there. It's very, very exciting.